I have just a brief message for you today because I knew we would be going over with our business meeting. We're going to look at Thomas. Poor Thomas. He just gets a bad rap, I think. We're going to look at his story here in John chapter 20, verses 19 through 31. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So this is a familiar story, and we all know Thomas. Thomas, who is, what do we call him? I forget. Oh, Doubting Thomas. That's right. Poor Thomas. Poor Thomas. We don't call Peter Denying Peter, even though he denied the Lord not once. And Thomas just didn't believe once. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And what we do? We made him the head of the church. Poor Thomas. Thomas, whose only fault was being like his fellow disciples, who also did not believe until Jesus himself stood in their midst and showed them his hands and his side. It says that in verse 20 that we just read, that when Jesus stood among them on the day he was resurrected, he showed them his hands and his side. Sometimes we give Thomas a bad rap because we're like, well, he was real specific on what he needed to see. I won't believe unless I touch the nail holes and put my hand in his side. His friends had just finished telling him. He stood among us and he showed us his hands and his side. And Thomas is like, well, yeah, okay, fine, but I'm not going to believe until I see that myself. And one step further, until I touch to see that it's real. It was too good to be true. When the ladies who had gone to the tomb in that early morning had come to the disciples and said, "He's risen," the disciples went, "Okay." No. They didn't. They did not believe them. Peter and John ran to the tomb to see that it was empty, and they walked home scratching their heads. They didn't believe. When the 2 came from Emmaus and said, "We've seen the Lord," they didn't believe. It wasn't until Jesus stood among them. It wasn't until they saw him that they finally believed. So Thomas is no different from any of the other disciples. No different. And in fact, I would say that Thomas was a man of great faith. Sometimes we think that the opposite of doubt is certainty. It's certainly what we want, right? When I'm feeling doubtful, what do I want? certainty. Show me the proof. Show me the proof so I can be certain. But the true opposite of doubt is faith. When you have certainty, you don't need faith. When you have certainty, it requires nothing from you to believe. It doesn't require faith. For Thomas, interestingly enough, even though he was not certain about Christ's resurrection, stayed with the other disciples for an entire week. He didn't say, I don't believe, and then pack his things and go home. He stayed with them, waiting for a week before Jesus stood in their midst again. And when Jesus addressed Thomas, what did he say? Come on, couldn't you have taken their word for it? No, that's not what he says. He says, Thomas, come, look. He addresses him by name. He addresses his specific questions and concerns by name. He says, come and look at my hands. Come, touch. Come, put your hand in my side. Jesus knows about Thomas's concerns, and Jesus doesn't rebuke him. Jesus says, if this is what you need to stand on firm footing, I will provide it. When we have questions and doubts, the temptation is to swallow them down and not let anybody know. To cover them up and hide them. To say, oh no, I'm certain. When we're really not. To claim to be on firm footing when we're so shaky. It doesn't do anyone any good. It doesn't do us any good. It doesn't do the people around us any good. And it doesn't allow God to address our insecurities. When we say, I have trouble with this. When we say, I'm not sure about that. We give God the chance to speak into our weakness. And what did Paul say? Paul said, God's power is made perfect in my strength. No, he said, God's power is made perfect in my weakness. When we pretend to be strong when we're weak, when we pretend to be sure when we doubt, we close the door on God's work in our lives. We say we don't need him. Whereas faith cries out, I believe, help my unbelief. It's a statement of faith. It's not a statement of doubt. It's a statement of faith because we're taking our weakness to the one place where we can find strength. We're taking our doubt to the one person who can answer our questions. When we admit our weakness, when we admit we doubt, we give God room to work in our lives. And we give other people around us permission to do the same. If you want God to work in their life, you have to let God work in your life first. If you want them to admit their weakness, you have to be willing to admit your weakness first. Don't we all have people in our lives who we would love to see God do amazing, incredible things in them? If we want that to happen, we need to be willing to show our own weakness, to allow God to work in us so that they can see, so that we can be witnesses of God's work, of God's healing, of God's redemption in us. John tells us that Jesus stood in their midst both times and proclaimed over them the thing he wanted for them, and that was peace. Not a peace as in tranquility or an absence of conflict, but peace that is a wholeness, a healing, a finality. Jesus wanted them to finally be at rest in him, to finally be open and honest so that he could come in and do his work in them. Peace be with you. And then Thomas says to him, my Lord and my God. And so the man we call Doubting Thomas is the first one to proclaim Christ's divinity. My Lord and my God. We should call him faith-filled Thomas. We should call him patient Thomas. We should call him waiting Thomas. We should call him declaring Thomas. But I think it's definitely time for us to stop calling him doubting Thomas.